Hello, everybody. It is Friday, July 12th. This is sig-aws. I am your moderator, facilitator, Justin Santa Barbara. I work at Google. This meeting is being recorded and will be put on the internet, and please be mindful, therefore, of our code of conduct, which boils down to be a good person. I am pasting a link to the agenda into the chat. We do have a couple of items on the agenda. Thanks, Jay, and thanks, Peter. Please do add any items to the agenda if you would like to be sure that we cover them. For people watching the video, it is helpful for them to, if we put your name in the agenda, so please feel free to do that if you would like to. Otherwise, I propose we jump straight into the first item, which is, Jay, you have a item about discussing a particular cloud provider issue.
Yeah, I've got a couple things on here. I was in the SIG Cloud Provider and SIG Architecture meetings this week, and there are a couple AWS-related things that came up. This particular one, issue 12 in Cloud Provider, let's see here.
It's about making cluster ID required in some sense.
Yeah, I was hoping Mike Crute might be on the call today because I know he had some opinions about this, but
yeah, we do have this cluster ID tag. I thought it was only required on AWS.
Yes,
so in other words,
that's kind of the crux of this particular issue is, do we still need this for the AWS cloud provider? And if not, can we get rid of it, basically, I guess?
That is okay. And I think I wrote in this issue that the issue that you linked, cloud provider issue 12, that we use it for like two purposes, right? For isolation and for cleanup is how I described it. So for isolation, we're able to tag the resources and therefore like stop accidental crossover between two clusters. And then for cleanup, if we tag the resources, external tooling like COPS or EKS cuddle or whatever it is, would then be able to, as part of the destruction of a cluster, know that a resource was created by a cluster and would be able to delete it or offer the ability to delete it. There is the potential to fix it to try to get isolation in other ways. It would be a fairly big change. I think one of the ones that there are places where we pass around node names. And if we passed around node objects, we would presumably be able to get rid of a bunch of these things, and it would be more efficient in general.
How would the node name be useful as a cluster-wide identifier?
I'm trying to remember. I'm just looking mostly at what I wrote.
I think what you were referring to there is being able to get the node ID via a tag lookup of using the cluster ID. But
I
think there are other ways of getting that information.
Yes, I mean the one which I know really matters is subnets. So we're able to or we have to select the particular subnets when we're creating a load balancer, for example. And the cluster ID tag is very important there if you have multiple subnets in your VPC, so that we are able to know, because often the subnets for your ELB will not be the same as the subnets in which your node runs. If you're running your nodes in private IP configurations, you run your ELBs in a different subnet, I believe.
Okay.
So that's sort of where it comes from. I don't think we should require cluster ID on other clouds, and I don't know, it's not clear that we have. I think if someone wants to push to reduce the number of places where we use cluster ID on AWS, that would be great. I don't know that it is trivial to get rid of it, to be honest.
Okay.
what was sort of the cloud provider or SIG architecture feeling? I don't really understand what they were.
Uh, it was mostly just to check in on on this and see if there'd been any sort of movements from a pull request perspective, or whether we still wanted to move forward with this. I think that from SIG cloud providers' perspective, it's just more of an annoyance that AWS, the cloud provider AWS functions slightly differently than the others with this cluster ID tagging. And there wouldn't need to be that allow untagged cloud flag or anything like that without this sort of functionality. I know that there was a call out to Craig Peters from Microsoft to determine whether Azure has a similar issue with cloud provider Azure. So anyway,
I think
I just added it on here. I said I'd bring it up at SIG AWS and see if you had any thoughts about it. But
I would hope this would go into.
It's a P2. I mean, it's not like it's,
I would hope this lands in the AWS cloud provider and doesn't stay in the kubelet in the long term. I think that will happen, but I'm not certain.
Is this in the kubelet or is this in the cloud control kube
Well,
control?
or like it wouldn't be in anything in the Kubernetes repo.
Right.
But you're right. It is in Kube Controller Manager. Correct. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
And
this, so this is sort of related to the other thing that I'd listed down, which came out in the SIG architecture meeting, which was around credential providers. Being able to get rid of that, or not get rid of it, but pull it out into a out of KK. And so the only way to do that, I believe, is to determine which ecosystem projects are directly importing the credential provider stuff from KK package, cloud provider, credential provider, whatever it is, directly, as opposed to having an interface in cloud.go in the cloud provider repo. You know what I mean? In sigs.k8s.io/cloud provider. It has all the interfaces for the cloud provider interface, right, in cloud.go. And I believe that we want to take the credential provider stuff into there. Right. So it's interface, it's abstracted as opposed to the somewhat tightly coupled situation that it has now.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Just before we, let's talk about that in a second. Before we do, I just want to, I realized the big difference, the reason why we have the cluster ID tag is because a sort of philosophical decision that I guess I made back in the early days was to discover things like subnets using those tags,
right, rather
than require it to be passed in a sort of configuration to the cluster. So there are
so that COPS can essentially create the things that it needs to do and store.
Yeah, I mean, like, so COPS or EKS cuddle has two options, right? It creates a bunch of subnets and it can either tag them, or it could say, I've created a bunch of subnets and I'm going to record their IDs and I'm going to put them into a config map in the cluster. Either one of those would be fine. We went with tags, or I went with tags, and perhaps that was the wrong choice, but that's where this cluster ID thing comes from. And so like from the SIG architecture perspective, or even we can make a decision on SIG AWS versus, like, I think it can be a local decision. Like, do we like the tag approach, or do we want to move towards an explicit enumeration approach where you have to specify in some config map rather than going and having the cloud provider going and discovering it type thing?
Yeah. Not sure.
Yeah. I think that's where that is the root of where it comes from. And I guess, so I think the things I would say is, like, eventually this becomes a SIG AWS specific requirement, the cluster ID, and that there is a existing philosophy of using tags and discovery, which we may decide is not the way to go. And there's actually a nice way to move to explicit enumeration as well. Like, you can have explicit enumeration. If it's not explicitly enumerated, you just go and do the tag discovery. But then we'd imagine the tooling would move to explicit enumeration, and you could basically then remove permissions for discovery because it'd be a fallback path that would never be hit. So we can get there, but I think those would be I think that would be our path forwards. I don't know if anyone is sufficiently concerned about this to work on it, in that it feels like extraction should be the first step before we.
Oh, for sure. Which is why, it's labeled P2.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
The other one you brought up, though, the challenge, as I understand it, is the process that consumes the credentials providers is kubelet.
Yeah.
So I don't. That's what makes this really hard. Is sure we can hide it behind an interface, but kubelet specifically needs to call into it to get credentials, and it wasn't, and that could be indirect. Like one of the proposals I think was to auto-populate image pull secrets as secrets in each namespace, or like alongside each pod, or whatever it would be, that sort of thing. So that then it could be, that's more of a Kubernetes controller approach. And I think Mike was looking at that, but I don't know what progress has been made there. It's also tricky because I think.
Yeah. So what you're essentially saying is we shouldn't put the abstraction into cloud provider, cloud.go or whatever, but rather put it into a separate library that can be consumed by kubelet and other agents or whatever that need it. Right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, which we kind of so we already have it in a separate library that is only consumed by kubelet, as far as I know.
But isn't it in cloud provider?
I don't think it's in cloud provider. I think Mike, there was some overlap where like they called into each other for convenience, but Mike Krug, I think, managed to split them so that they are like totally separate. I think the challenge is that this is a different flow or a different path that we haven't established how it should work in a world where where there is no cloud provider code in the kubelet.
In a world.
Imagine a world.
Okay, then I'll have a chat later today if I can get hold of Mike specifically about this and see whether I can get it further along.
Cool. Yes. That does feel like a SIG cloud provider or SIG architecture topic.
Oh, it is. It came from SIG architecture.
Yeah.
So I'm not entirely sure why it was labeled SIG cloud provider, because it's more SIG node actually. But
and sig-aws, right? Security.
Yeah, sig-aws.
I think cloud provider approach needs to come up with a proposal and then have the other SIGs tell us why it won't work or something like that. But yeah. I guess, yeah, that would be a good thing. I had a conflict in this week's cloud provider, but yeah, I think I should attend that and see what's going on. But yes, I believe there's a wrinkle in that theoretically you could set up ECR, like Amazon ECR integration on bare metal or on GCE, for example, which is a wonderful thought. I'm not quite sure why anyone would do that because it feels really complicated, but yes, I think you could do such a thing.
I'm not sure either.
But yes, if you have your code in ECR, if you have your code in GCR, if you have your code in that, then I don't think there's anything that stops you configuring the kubelet with your AWS or GCE credentials so that you can like integrate with those things, even if you're not running on the cloud in question, which is interesting.
Yeah, that would be an interesting experiment to see, like launch a bunch of instances in GKE or GCP and then load up an AWS credentials provider and use your AWS IAM account from the I don't know, whatever. Be interesting.
Work, but yes, I don't. As far as I know, no one is actually doing it, which is the sort of saving grace. I think that like it isn't necessarily critical, but I do suspect if we remove the ability to do that, that someone will, the person that is doing it will pop up. But
All right. Well, we kind of discussed the AWS account thing with BossGos earlier. Well, let's just skip through that. And Peter, you've got a question about the status of the AWS ALB ingress controller.
Yeah, it's kind of a feature request that's been out for a while and requested often in other GitHub issues, but essentially this is requesting, currently the ingress controller creates one ALB per ingress, and ingresses need to live in one namespace, which means if we have many namespaces, you're required to have many ALBs. ALBs have a fixed cost for running, each month, $20 or so. So having many ingresses means paying more for many ALBs. So the request is to provide grouping so that they can kind of be collapsed into one ALB. And I'm just
All right. Let me ping Young. 1 second.
Are you linked to an issue? Is there a PR? Because I saw some people were asking when it was going to be merged. Was that just a misunderstanding?
I believe that Moonfish said he was working on it, and it looks like in the
Young's working on it, but Peter, I'm
So actually, Young get a demo for Ingress Group a while back. I think the code should have been merged, or there's in some non-pretty production ready branch. Just ping Young. I think it should be pretty close.
Thanks, Cheng.
Okay, cool.
I don't know who the, I guess I'm an owner, but I don't know who the main owners of that are, like who the sort of primary maintainers are. Looks like Moonfish is a big Craig. That's Craig from Ticketmaster, I believe. But yeah, Moonfish, if you, well, I don't think he's here, but if you need to.
Yeah, that was Cheng.
Okay.
But I can chat with Young later. Peter, we don't give actual dates or anything, and we try not to say like real soon now or anything like that. But I can see if there is a specific code that Young has been working on. And
great, thank you.
I think for the record, why don't we quickly talk about the BossGos stuff, Jay? So we were talking about it before. There is some test infra. There's this thing called BossGos, which, as we talked about, sort of like lets different tests sort of multiplex onto a smaller set of GCP projects or AWS projects.
AWS accounts.
AWS accounts, thank you, because
/logins.
The complexity was exactly as you say, that AWS doesn't have the same hierarchy that GCP has. It has a different hierarchy than GCP has.
Right.
And that caused some confusion.
So essentially what happened was there's this thing called the janitor, which is part of BossGos that runs in test infra. And when this janitor daemon runs, it cleans up resources that were leased to a particular prow job for running a set of tests. Well, what was happening was because these were all separate logins and not separate accounts, the janitor was essentially cleaning up resources that were owned by different logins because it was doing everything for the account. I guess that's the best way to describe what was happening, Justin. But
yes,
kind of.
Yes, it was. And we had previously cheated and used regions to isolate things.
Yes.
And it was no longer using regions because there was an assumption that these were in fact separate accounts, whereas in fact they were just different users.
Different logins, IAM users or whatever. Cheng, what's the appropriate terminology? Is it IAM user or is it IAM login, or because there's an account, right? And then there are multiple IAM users within
I believe
an account.
Users, they each have their own credentials.
Yeah. Okay. So that.
And we need to create more accounts, is my understanding.
either that or possibly use the AWS organizations thing, which
may or may not be the same thing.
May or
but we
may
will
not
find
work,
out.
but we'll figure it out.
But I'm sure it'll work. We just don't know whether it's we are going to. So Jay and I are going to try to create something after this and see if we can make sense of it.
I put out the bat signal to Ishwar to try and figure this out. Anyway, cool. So, all right. So anybody have any other topics?
That is the end of our agenda.
Oh, Cheng dropped off.
He was done.
He's like, I'm done with this. All right. Well, you know where to find me. I'll be on Slack. Good.
Well, I'll ping you immediately after this. Yeah. But yeah.
Fine.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. That I guess wraps up sig-aws, and we will see everybody in 2 weeks.
Sounds good. Peter, if I hear from Moonfish, I'll ping you on Slack.
Perfect. Thank you.
Cool. Ciao.
Bye, everybody.